case I can't see.
We all have that.
We're waiting for the live stream. That's why we're pausing. Good, we are live. Okay, good morning everybody. I'd like to wish you a very, very warm welcome to the launch of Growing Global Executives, the new Competencies, a very important piece of research and book being launched today. Thank you very, very much for coming. My name is Rod Bristow. I am the president for the UK and what we call core markets, about another 75 countries, responsible for all of our work in education in Pearson in those countries. I just want to say before introducing Sylvia, who will join, who will come to the stage to talk about this work. I just want to say a little bit about the reason why we in Pearson are very proud to have been able to sponsor this research, and very proud of our long-standing association with the Centre for Talent Innovation and the work that we have done alongside and in partnership. We are an education company, and what we hear when we talk to our stakeholders, customers, teachers, students, parents, all around the world, when we talk about education and ask them what their views on education are, they tell us that above all else they want the education for their children to provide a much better connection to success in life. If there's one thing that people want, it's how is my education going to help me succeed in life? What are the skills that are going to help me do that? So it's not just about numeracy, literacy, science, geography, history, all those important academic subjects. It's also about how am I going to be best equipped to succeed in life? And of course there's a very, very compelling connection between that idea and the work of the Centre for Talent Innovation. And indeed, in the spirit of always learning, these soft skills are skills that are important to be begun to understood early in life, but developed throughout your life and throughout your career. They're soft skills, but they've got very hard outcomes. And for that reason, sometimes they don't get the attention that they deserve, that they're seen as soft. But when you think about the very, very hard outcomes that these skills has for how people can succeed in life, and I think this is something that the research shines a light on, you realise how important they are. Another reason why this work the work of CTI is very, very relevant to the way we work in education is the idea of inclusivity. This is a theme that recurs time and again in the research. In fact, a lot of the work, I think, from what I've understood of the Centre for Talent Innovation, does put a sharp focus on the importance of inclusivity and how important that is for successful organisations to thrive, to develop the talent. It's also a very important theme in education as a whole. There are still far too few people in the world, actually particularly women, that don't get the education that they deserve. So the idea of inclusivity is central to our work in education as well. And of course, finally and last but not least, is that the work that CTI does is relevant to us as an organisation. In fact, we've been very pleased with the way in which CTI has been able to support our own thinking around talent development in Pearson, and that's something that we hope to continue. So I'm very grateful to Centre for Talent and Innovation and to Sylvia, the Chief Executive and Founder of the organization. Sylvia is somebody who, in the short time that I've known her, has fantastic connections in the corporate world and beyond. She also has great substance, as is proven by the rigor of the research and the findings that some of which Sylvia will be sharing with you. In short, Sylvia really is a rock star. So I'm going to invite Sylvia to the stage now. Thank you, Sylvia. Cheers.
Thank you. Well, Rod, that is an amazing introduction. Thank you. And what I'm going to do is really plunging, because we're on a timer, I think, because we're reaching all kinds of fabulous leaders around the world today. So I want to start with just placing this research in a context. 12 years ago, I founded CTI. At the time, it was just 7 companies. Today, it's 87. And we do research across 11 countries. Not the 75 you were talking about, Rod, but really a lot of the growth hubs in this world. And some of these players are, standout players, but we have leaders and learners. And in fact, no one's cracked this talent challenge in ways that they're truly feeling smug about. So everyone is on this journey. I'm particularly grateful to the co-chairs of the task force who really put in considerable thought leadership, as well as really invest in our research. And it was at a meeting of the co-chairs some 2 years ago that this project got off the ground. Amongst that incredibly committed group, there was one urgent question that particular day. They were increasingly frustrated by their inability to lift up local talent. For instance, one player said that, 20 years later, and we've been struggling with this, we have no one who really belongs in our major Asian markets above the director level. And this has to change, because you cannot truly innovate for the brand new marketplace of this world without enormously powerful local talent. So let me just share 2 elements which make this case so urgently. First off, if you look out over the next couple of decades, right, 2/3 of the growth of this world is going to be in the 8 emerging markets that are in our study. Because in this study, we have some mature markets. We have the US, UK, Japan. But we also have Hong Kong, Singapore, the BRICS, and Turkey, and South Africa. They were chosen by our task force as ones that they were particularly interested in. We are always driven by our members. So this data is remarkable because it is about the far-flung growth hubs that are 2/3 of everything going forward. Just to give a little spin on the mission and purpose of CTI, we are about the full realization of all the new streams of highly qualified people in the global labor market. The new streams encompass, women for sure, minorities, LGBTs, and local talent in emerging markets. And obviously, this is not a sideshow anymore. Caucasian straight guys are just 17% of the college-educated global talent pool. Everyone else is multicultural, female, has some other gender identification, et cetera, et cetera. So, obviously we are not about a minority. We're about the broad mainstream of the available talent pool in the global marketplace. The other thing which makes this extraordinarily urgent is the decline of the expat model. Of the current crop of executive level folks in the Fortune 500, for instance, just as an example, only 12% are expats in the old school definition of that. Not so long ago, 56% were expat. The expat model has become incredibly expensive, but it's also seen as not a great model. These folks oftentimes are not sufficiently in touch with what's going on the cutting edge. Okay, so what did we find out in this study? And it rests on a representative sample of 3,000 managers and executives across these 11 countries. We did a ton of virtual focus groups and over 100 interviews. So quite a lot of data collection went into this study. Today, I just want to emphasize 3 things, and I will try and tell some stories, make it a little vivid. Obviously, you all have the book. There's lots of stuff in there, but I'm not trying to cover the waterfront this morning. So first off, if you are an ambitious, accomplished local talent, first off, you have to project credibility. How do you impress the heck out of folks back in headquarters? How do you win the respect and the trust of your team and your stakeholders in local markets? I mean, this is a big agenda, and it's done across distance and difference. This is not easy, right? We find that projecting credibility is, as Rod said, not just about your performance, not about those numbers at the end of last year. It's about particularly gravitas. When we've done our studies of what is executive presence, what is credibility in the States, we find there are these 3 buckets: how you behave, how you sound, how you speak, and how you look. The biggest chunk is the gravitas piece. How do you project the idea that you're the real deal? That you're, 6 questions deep in your domain of expertise, that you look as though you could inspire a following, that kind of stuff. And what we were able to do in our study is really parse out what the top 6 behaviors were across these global markets in terms of what was gravitas. The thing that is very different from, say, a US study is that demonstrating integrity is clearly number 1. It's as though it's table stakes. You're not going to project credibility anywhere unless you can be trusted, unless you project the sense of values and an ability to stick with those values, as you can see, top of the list. But then it's quite the astounding mix, because it's inspiring a following, it's conveying EQ, it's projecting authority. This is a complex map, but they are the top 6 out of 40 qualities that our respondents were looking at. And here's the rub. The behaviors that get you credibility and demonstrate your gravity of weight, of leadership ability, are different depending on whether you're relating up the what we call the vertical pivot, relating back to headquarters, and the horizontal pivot, the demonstration of being able to win trust and respect in local marketplaces. So there's a certain kind of versatility that is involved here, and I think it shows up most clearly in terms of looking at the way in which authority plays out. If you're projecting back to headquarters, the assertive, the authoritative, the sharp-edged, American model or Anglo-American model seems to be pretty much alive and well. Those characteristics are not particularly valued in too many local markets, where a buy-in, an inspirational mode of leadership, is much more valued. So we see that we have this double pivot going on, and if you are really going to impress the hell out of, both groups, you've got to be able to do this double pivot. And let me tell you the story of Makiko Edo. She is one of the stars in the book. Here's her story. She is the president of Japan Intel's operations. She's also a vice president on the global sales team at Intel, so she also has a really global role. And she said that when she started climbing the tree as a local talent in Japan, she found her, trips back to Silicon Valley to attend meetings there, to, deal with top leadership there, truly daunting. She was flummoxed by the idea that you had to cut and thrust, that you had to interrupt people at meetings, and you had to really, she said, I had to put my iron panties on when I went to Silicon Valley. And it was uncomfortable, difficult to do, but she learned to do it. She said, for a Japanese to interrupt a senior person is an incredibly audacious thing. And what it did mean for her is that she prepared like crazy. She had to make sure that she had, 3 pieces of evidence, which was so compelling that she would be forgiven for the interruption, because it was so valuable, what she was about to say. And then, of course, when she went back to Japan, she had to reassume the much more deferential, much more respect-filled attitude that really had won her such success in the Japanese marketplace. And it was interesting, she said her direct reports always felt she changed personality when she changed languages. In English, she was this, cut and thrusting kind of person who was a very authoritative figure. But then, speaking Japanese, she reverted to some of the much more consensual, deferential, characteristics which were more intrinsically her style. She said, look, I didn't give up my authenticity in either context because I have very strong opinions. And I am for sure incredibly prepared. And my ideas are always on point. It's a question of how you get them across. But then the complication was that she became very powerful across Asia. And she said, look, I had all of these minor double pivots going on, because when she was dealing with the Taiwanese and the Koreans, she had to be very nuanced. And she said it required one-on-ones, endless amount of one-on-ones, to coax out the real decision-making. And then she went to India, a whole different universe. And, given the attachment to open debate, she said what she learned to do in India was giving all of her top team extraordinary amounts of airspace, because she said they had an opinion on everything and they were not going to be collaborative until she had heard them out. And she said, India is Asia, but not my Asia. Anyway, I think, again, a great story in terms of this in action. And what we were able to do here is actually measure if you got these behaviors right, you actually did progress at a more rapid rate than your cohort. So there's a certain proof in the pudding of these behaviors working. So we were very proud of these figures. Moving on, the other thing I want to emphasize is that although you see these pretty massive differences between the vertical and the horizontal pivot, let's not forget that life is complicated and our data from the individual regions is very nuanced. For instance, if we take these 3 countries, again, a lot of agreement that integrity is pretty much at the top of the heap, not quite number 1, but number 2 in India. But again, the treatment of authority, very, very different in these 3 local markets. What we heard from our interviews is that China still has that legacy of the communist era, right? Authority is a weird thing in a Chinese company. There has to be a lot of shared, seemingly shared, decision-making. And India, again, tends to be, an ex-British territory still to some extent. And the old-style command and control culture has more legs there than some other countries. So we got complicated once we saw the patterns. We are able to, show the nuances in this picture. The other thing that we also were very aware of is the gender lens. For instance, take Brazil. and take the issue of authority. Well, 79% of employees expect male leaders to project authority in a very assertive way, and it works. Only 21% believe it works when women project authority in an assertive way. Now, each of these countries has gender norms, many of them much stronger than that which is true, say, in the UK or the US. And the most sexist country of all is Russia. Interestingly enough, extraordinary, extreme figures from Russia. But, you know, if you are managing a global team, this is very interesting because although we would like these cultures to be moving in a more gender equity direction, if you want to get promoted next week, you know, you better pay attention to what works now. The other thing, again, this is again not unexpected, but we have all the data around it. EQ, massive expectations that women have this tape, that they really have it in their bones, and of course they'll do it. Again, in China, you know, 61% of, I think that's 61 or maybe it's 64, my eyesight isn't what it should be, they expect female leaders to just have this, to have the kind of empathy factor at their fingertips. They don't expect men to exercise that too much. And again, you know, differences across country in terms of what works as a local female talent, what works as a local male talent. The next category I want to look at very briefly, there is tremendous comfort here. It turns out that inclusive leadership traits work right across the world. There's not much difference in terms of what inclusive leadership looks like. To give you some sense, there are 6 behaviors that stand out above all else in terms of unlocking new ideas, endorsing new ideas, the ability to really find brand new market places which are underdeveloped, needs that are unmet. The behaviors are the same, with obviously a little bit of variation across all of these marketplaces. And to just give you some sense of the 2 critical things that these leadership behaviors unlock. First off, you're much more likely to take a big risk if you have these behaviors going on in your top ranks. And secondly, you're much more likely to share the out-of-the-box ideas that really work in these marketplaces. And you're probably familiar with the work we've done on ideation and innovation and diversity. And roughly speaking, if you have these 6 behaviors really embedded in your leadership culture, you are 30% more likely as a team to develop a new marketplace. So finally, I want to look at sponsorship. Because here's the thing. You're projecting credibility. You've got people's attention. You're seen as a standout talent because you are projecting that credibility. You're driving value because you have the team dynamics at a very productive spot. You are making progress in terms of market growth. How do you get from the middle to the top? How do you crack through that director level glass ceiling which all of our task force members were describing? Well, basically, you've got to win sponsorship. We've done a lot of work on sponsorship. Eileen has been very involved in it, for instance. What we find is that there's this vast difference between old-style mentoring, which, you know, is supportive and full of guidance and goodwill, which is kind of a gift to any up-and-coming talent, and true sponsorship. A sponsor is someone who knows your work and your value well, is willing to take a bet on you. And there's risk in this because they're advocating for the next job, the next promotion. If you mess up, there's egg on both of your faces, right? This younger person is walking around with your brand on their forehead, so you better know this person and really understand they can deliver. And in the global marketplace, this senior folk, right, is understanding that you know the local market conditions better than he or she does, and therefore you have a lot of rope to do what you feel might work. We find globally what we find in the US and in the UK. Sponsorship is a mini-me situation. The top people replicating themselves, often people in their circle from their home country, because of the trust. They don't quite understand that this person sitting in Singapore or in Sao Paulo, where I was earlier this week, really is the real deal. They don't know them well enough. They've seen the numbers, and they've been impressed in a kind of vague way by their leaderly attributes and their gravitas, but do they really trust them with a huge new budget for something? So here's what we find in the data. If you are sponsored, this is what happens. You are much more likely to get a really senior promotion, a rotation at headquarters perhaps. In other words, lots of good stuff really does happen to people who are sponsored. But there is a rather distressing reality out there in global markets. Individuals who win sponsorship from a local person has an 11% bump in their career. If you're able to bring off sponsorship back in headquarters, you have a 36% bump in your career, right? So this is the real problem. People get stalled out because they do not have someone really high enough up to open doors for them. Now, you know, sponsorship has happened since the Stone Age. It's how power is transferred in organizations. And power is transferred. People die. They retire. Power is handed on. What we are able to do, obviously, in this research is really lay out in data terms what the barriers are for this key talent in markets which are 2/3 of the equation going forward. In a world where we are learning not to use expats. We are, in this research, able to show some amazing examples of some actions by companies which are, I think, more than nibbling at the edges of this problem set. For instance, EY has created 3-month career rotations for high-performing kind of 29, 31-year-olds to precisely mix it up. And it's very two-directional. As many individuals get sent from emerging markets back to the mature market hubs as vice versa. It's an attempt to get sponsorship started, right? Because, you know, you can't develop sponsorship via email. You know, it has to have some high-touch components. Bloomberg has done something very simple recently, which we've added to with this research. They have a 3-month global call kind of training program for everyone. What this is creating a tremendous framework around global conference calls and global video conferencing, which right now are an extraordinary time suck for most people and not used well. For instance, very simple ground rules. You distribute materials at least 6 hours before the call, right? You make sure the technology is working. In our data, 30% of conference calls experience technological glitches, so a whole lot of time is wasted. You've got to have someone try it out beforehand. You have the courtesy as the leader of the call to sum up what decisions were made on the call, right? And you make sure that particularly new people far away get some airtime. There are lots of data points that we have in terms of how to make this efficient. And clearly, if you're trying to project credibility over cyberspace, it is particularly, important that you get some of these ground rules down. But the thing we are most excited about is that there are some companies beginning to work with us to create a pathway to sponsorship, figuring out exactly what kinds of learning tools and tactics can work for the global talent, and how leaders can best, learn and profit from some of the steps that make them extraordinary global sponsors, able, to grow leaders in these far-flung parts of the world. So thank you, and I'm now going to hand over to my good friend and esteemed colleague, Trevor Phillips. You all know Trevor. He is, I think, a very celebrated person in the UK, particularly since his very recent huge success with his television documentary on race. But I think we also remember his huge role as he chaired the UK Equalities and Human Rights Commission. So Trevor, come up to the podium with your distinguished panel.
Well, thank you very much, Sylvia. And being declared celebrated at this time in the morning is a great boost for the ego. I think people say lots of things about me. Celebrated isn't usually one that comes up. It's great to be here. Not least because it's 9:30 here in London, and I always like, as a journalist, to listen for the phrases, and I think my phrase of the week, which will not leave me, I'm pretty sure, memorable phrase of the morning: iron panties. Okay, I think we don't have to say anything more about that. Just let it stick there. This is a tremendously important piece of work. I'm going to introduce our panel in a second, but I get to say a couple of words to begin our discussion, and then I will become a proper traffic policeman. The first thing is that here in London, this is an important morning. The government will announce that the FTSE 100 will have hit the target set a couple of years ago, 4 years ago, by Lord Davis, 25% gender diversity in boards. That's a good thing. There are various caveats that people have about it, that the emphasis has been on non-executives, the question about whether diversity has now become all and only about gender diversity, but let's set that aside. It's a good sign. But I think what this work tells us is that actually, though that's an important question, it is to some extent yesterday's question. What we're dealing with here is tomorrow's project. And picking up on something that Sylvia said at the end of her remarks, we're in the great rush of globalization. There is not going to be any turning back. We have to deal with the world as it's going to become. And it's clear that too many of us are still behind the curve. For our discussion, I think there are a couple of points I want to make. One is that at the core of some of the difficulty here is that all people of goodwill tend to think, we're all human. Essentially, when we all learn our lessons, we go to, get our MBAs and so on, we're all going to become the same, and everybody is going to be kind of like us. Completely wrong. And that, it sounds like a ridiculous thing to say, but businesses all over the world are beginning to grasp that, as Rods is saying, this isn't just a soft issue of politeness. This is about money. You lose. The second thing, again, to emphasize Sylvia's point, this works both ways, about people in this case coming from outside Europe, and traffic going the other way. And I wanted to make a point about the value of technology, because that, alongside globalization, technology is, of course, changing virtually everything that we do and the way we do it, and it has to change, and it has changed our behavior. The point was being made about the technology working or not working. If you're at the wrong end of the video conferencing not working, it's not just a technological problem, it's a lack of respect. What you know is that the people in New York and London don't really care very much about whether you're on or not. And that is an experience that will stay with people for the whole of their career. It won't be something they'll forget next week. They will remember that you didn't bother to make sure that they were in on the conversation. On research, one of the things that struck me, I was looking at it again last night, very, very interesting point. The place of integrity compared to the place of reputation. Very, very interesting point. If you watch The Apprentice, and you know, Donald Trump notwithstanding, or Alan Sugar here, there is a sense that, you know, to get on business, what you've got to do is to make sure that the right people think well of you, that your reputation is secure in the right place. I think this research is rather reassuring. It's rather reassuring, the knowledge that integrity, consistency, at root, honesty, really counts. And lastly, I just want to make a point, picking up on Rod's remark about what in the jargon now people call CQ, cultural intelligence, people not investing in it. Sylvia mentioned the EY Global New Horizons program. At EY, who I work with some time, one of the things that they say is that they've learned people will spend tens of millions, possibly hundreds of millions, making sure that the computer in London or New York talks to the computer in Delhi or Hong Kong. But they forget that they may need to spend a little bit of money in making sure that once the computers have spoken to each other, somebody knows what they've said. And somebody understands what's been said at either end of that chain. So, we have on our panel, I don't need to bang on too much about how distinguished they are. They each have great titles, and they all come from respected worldwide brands. Isabel Gomez-Vidal, from Managing Director, Head of Sales, Moody's. Van Dyke Silveira, CEO for the FTIE Corporate Learning Business. And Sophia Skinner, who's the Vice President and General Manager, Travel and Lifestyle Services at American Express. And I am being invited to remind everybody, technology, that hashtag is, our hashtag is hashtag GlobalExecs 2015. Hashtag GlobalExecs 2015. So get tweeting. So let's go to our panel. Let me ask you each first one thing. What was your top insight from the research, Isabel?
For me, if I had to pick up one theme, that's got to be the importance of leading inclusively as well as building and winning trust. And I'm going to share a personal story. This is a few years back. I had a situation with one of the local offices where I had a change management type of situation with the additional challenge of an acquisition taking place at the very same time. And as a result of that, one of the local leaders actually left the firm. So that created a mix of reactions and emotions around the employees in that local office. Many of them felt disengaged, they felt mistrust from the headquarters, many of them felt unheard. And to me, it was very clear there was a cultural divide. So I had to act very, very quickly and engage massively and find a way to create a sense of connection with the local people. So I was very intentional about, over the following months, going to that local office very, very often, meet the local employees in person and get to know them personally and professionally. So I would hold team meetings with the idea of listen well and paying attention to what they had to say and being present with them without jumping into conclusions, without a mindset of trying to criticize, but really from a place of an open heart and an open mind of understanding why things were done in a certain way in that local office. I also was very mindful about applying the right pace of change, because you cannot rush things through. You can't win trust in one day. That takes time, and it takes investment, and it takes a lot of listening, and you have to give in order to get something back. Also during that journey, I was very intentional about identifying the next leader that could actually carry the message forward. So I started giving to that high potential in that local office, stretch assignments, special projects, to build him up to the next level. Now, fast forward, I am really pleased to say that we have a very high engaged team. We also have a very strong manager on the ground who carries the message across, who brings unity, who leads by example in an inclusive way. So what I've learned from that experience is the importance of being inclusive, but also the fact that you have to pivot your style, your management style, because in that situation I have to apply a high dose of emotional intelligence in order to connect with the local employees, which it may be very different from the way I communicate in the headquarters. So back to the book, I was reading the book and that story came to my mind. Yeah.
Just a quick question. You clearly had to invest a lot of physical presence.
Yeah.
Was that something you had to do at the beginning, or still have to do? How did it work?
I have to do it more intentionally at the very beginning, talking about a number of months, and then gradually I don't have to go as often as I used to go. I still believe as a manager, as a leader, that you need to have some level of physical contact with people, but because now I have the local leader on the ground, there's no need so much, and I've empowered him. There's not so much need for me to go as often as I used to have.
Van Dijk, what stood out for you?
Well, I have to agree with Isabel. For me, the most important thing, and it resonates with me in my career, in my experience, is a tandem of two things. Is the double pivot. Double pivot it's an instrumental insight. Sylvia's very right in pointing out there is a two-layer style or model for you to interact. Something that gets you attention locally, and then you can deploy locally, and that requires emotional intelligence skills. But then in order for you to be noticed at headquarters, you have to go beyond numbers, you have to go beyond the local thing. You need to have similarities or commonality of values with people at the headquarters who can sponsor you, at the same time remain true to who you are. So it's the case of the Japanese lady. When you were talking about the Japanese lady, Mikiko, I said, well, this has a lot to do with me. When I speak English, I act in a very different way than when I speak Portuguese. And people notice that. It seems like you're a different person. And, even though Brazil, and I'm originally from Brazil, by the way, even though Brazil and the Anglo-Saxon world have very similarities in terms of authority, but the way I exude authority in the United States or in the UK is different from the way I do it in Brazil or other countries that you have to modulate. So I normally call it modulation, and you call it the double pivot. This leads to the essential question: how do I earn the reputation, the authority, and the visibility from local leaders who promote me to the point that I can be visualizable by headquarter leadership? And this is very interesting because, again, there's a double level. In order for you to be visualized locally, it has a lot to do with numbers and the reputation. But nobody gets promoted to headquarters because you're a great technical person. You can find a wonderful finance person in pretty much any place. You know, you don't get there because of that. There's something else that basically spearheads you into, it has to do with emotional intelligence and the ability to have that concerted effort to share, understand the similarities of the headquartered culture and the organizational culture, be an ambassador for that, but you can transit between north and south and east and west with that. So these are the 2 points for me that are very, very striking.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I'll come back in a moment. So, Sophia.
For me, I think as I read the book, there was so much that resonated. It's a very powerful book, and I think what's great about it doesn't just make the case, but it's really instructive in a lot of the hows and helps you label things that you know intuitively. And so for me, it's a fairly similar theme, and I'll give a bit more of a personal example on it. The double pivot was also the one for me, popular. My role, I report into my leader in New York, which is the headquarters for American Express. I have responsibility for teams in 24 countries around the world. And what I realized, and I loved the chart earlier that Sylvia shared with us, you know, each of us has strengths and each of us has areas we're focused on developing. And when I first saw that, you could almost stack up my strengths fell on the local market side and my development areas were on the managing to the vertical. And just that insight really helped solidify in my own mind what I need to work on as a leader and how I can continue to progress for myself. So I think for those reading the book, I'm sure there will be many light bulb moments for people in terms of their development. The one interesting piece and sort of the light bulb that went for me was remembering a time where I'd had discussions with my leader in New York, and you know, they'd expressed, you know, giving me advice on executive presence, and that's, you know, it's a very broad label. Yeah. And I'd had, you know, advice on how I should think about my executive presence, and I took that on board and was thinking about it. And then what didn't resonate for me was the 90% of people I interacted with on most occasions, I was high on executive presence. And it's not until you really piece it down and understand what I'm strong at was the followership and the inspiration. What I needed to work on was the projecting authority and how to bring that together. But it was all labeled the same label. Yes. So for me, that kind of helped me personally and hopefully will help others. And it came to life when my leader from New York actually witnessed me in front of my team. And she took me aside afterwards and she's like, had I never seen you in front of your team, I wouldn't have realized how good you are at your job. And that's not something that you can make happen all the time, but it was something that I realized I was fortunate to have that experience, and it kind of made me think about how do you think about not just the sponsorship and your relationship with headquarters, but how do you make sure that your leaders have some insight into what you're doing on a local basis so that they can experience that personally. So thank you for that. It was very, very helpful for me.
Well, let's follow up this issue of the double pivot for a moment, because stories you describe are very telling, but of course all leaders are transparent, and you're transparent both ways. Mm-hmm. I wonder whether there is a situation in which you may find yourself appearing, if I can put it this way, to be inconsistent. Now, your point, Van Dijk, was about values, and sometimes the issue is that the values here aren't necessarily completely consonant with the values over here. How do you avoid, you might be successful at pivoting, but does that then mean that potentially, essentially, you look a little bit two-faced?
I don't think so. When I experienced this myself, when I talk about values, I'm talking about integrity above everything else. Integrity is something that doesn't pivot and doesn't modulate. Correct. And the research shows that. You know, it's pretty consistent across the data. What I talk about in terms of values is espousing the organizational value, espousing certain values that the people who can promote you have. I'm going to give a very objective example. I met Rod in Brazil about 2.5 years ago, actually 3 years ago already. And we all had a similar interest in creating CLA. CLA was a product of a 4-year conversation. and we changed hands. We had a meeting, a presentation here that was brought to present here to Rod and his team. And then we had this post-meeting dinner in Brazil. We ascertained that we could work together and things were good and we had a great project in hand. On the other hand, there were more things that we had in common. You know, Rod is an avid rider, bike rider, and I am an avid motorcycle rider. So these values start to approach us and bring us together beyond the purely business intent. And we start to go beyond that. And we forge ties that can basically take me to different locations. There's somebody that reminds me or is reminded of me by different experiences he has. So things like this are really functional. It's not that you change your face. It's not, but you share things. It's like Immanuel Kant said. You know, it's like if we work as nations that share values, not just the immediate great values of human rights or the great values of honesty, but we're talking about values about, you know, what we think about life, the experience of living. We can see the differences that, you know, Sylvia normally talks about the difference in distance. The difference in distance, they get reduced to a great extent. In the end, we're two guys who like to ride nice motorcycles. And then business can happen in that context.
Okay, I don't want to get into who's got a Ducati and who's got a what. But okay.
You like motorcycles?
Sylvia, can you face both ways consistently?
Yes, because as I was thinking about the question, I think it's about emphasis. It's not, you're not changing your values, you're not changing your decisions, right? Your opinions are consistent. It's what you choose to emphasize in the meeting with the audience, and you may talk about vision and future to one audience, and for another audience you're looking at facts and figures and priorities, and your delivery may be different. Mm-hmm. So I think, you know, the authenticity in leadership is critical all the way through, which is your point. And I don't think you have to lose that. I think it really is just, again, understanding the audience and being very clear that those emphasis needs to change.
Okay. Before we go to Q&A, let me ask you something as well. You talked about the way that you dealt with the local situation. To what extent does solving those problems, changing the way the relationship you have with the teams locally, call for a change in culture in HQ? Because in the old days, HQ used to send people out to carry the culture.
Yeah.
And actually, it's companies with very strong cultures that they believed in would say, actually, what we need to do is to take our culture to Ghana or to Brazil or indeed to France, and we will show them how it's done.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, doing what you do must mean that somebody in HQ has got to change their minds about the way things are done.
I think partially they have to be open-minded and flexible, again, on going back to pivoting as well, the ability to be able to flex how you deliver certain messages depending what you are. I don't think nothing changes. It's important that the corporate culture is consistent across, doesn't matter what location you are, but being mindful to know that things in the Middle East might be slightly different. You need to comply with different rules and norms, and you as a headquarter has to be aware of that and adapt accordingly. But still you can be consistent with the overall corporate culture. So it's a question of finding the right balance.
Okay.
One thing that calls my attention is two movements that are happening right now. You know, we have the development of multinational organizations that have their origin in emerging markets, in the growth hubs. Yeah. And I think one of the best examples is what happened with AB InBev, that started in Brazil and then took over. It was partially acquired by Interbrew in Belgium. Then the hub culture took over the headquarter culture, and then they acquired Anheuser-Busch, and recently, 2 weeks ago, Saab Miller. And, you know, one very important point about cultural awareness in cultural intelligence, which is another level of pivot, which is going to happen at the core countries, is the ability to work with executives from emerging markets. This is one of the things that I heard from Chinese officials last year when I was visiting Hong Kong, and we had the experience of talking to some mainland Chinese officials in terms executive development and where to train and how to train. They said, we're not so much interested now in training our people to work in the West, but we are very concerned about the quality of leadership we're going to have from Westerners working with Chinese leaders. Yep. And this is going to be replicated to other locations in the world. So this is another layer. So I see this configuration of pivoting in the importation or determination of the local culture by a headquarter being something that's dwindling. You know, it's a waste of time because there's a lot of innovation that's coming out of those growth hubs. For example, for Ford, the EcoSport mini SUV, it was an invention in an emerging market. It got exported to other places, you know, and things like that are happening over and over. So it's very important that the cultural pivot also goes both ways, and culture is not just determined by one side or the other. Yeah. You know, it's a two-way avenue. Yeah.
Having said that, though, Sophie, you've got a global product, and it looks the same everywhere. It's got to look the same. Isn't there a danger with all of this that actually what you end up with is those local people, they do things in some lovely way locally, but they mess with the global brand?
So yes, there's always a risk. And I think, and what I would say is, you know, clearly American Express, we're a global company, and we don't have it all figured out. Hence, we're so grateful to Sylvia and her team to be in part of this research and involved in this learning. I think, you know, it's a balance, right? It's a balance in terms of embracing the innovation, bringing those changes in, and having a level of standardization that's not constraining or holding back that creativity or the innovation. So I think we're all seeking to get the balance right. What I do think, to your point on does headquarters have to change? Yes. And I think that's also a journey. And I think to your point, Sylvia, you know, you've got to recognize the norm that's operating now and work through how to influence that change. And I think there are two things I'd call out that we're doing at American Express. One is we are still bringing in, you know, aspiring high potential leaders from around the globe into headquarters. We have an accelerated learning and development program. It's mentioned in the book. And we are vested in really giving those potential leaders an intense experience in headquarters, because it also allows them to have the exposure, the recognition, the sponsorship opportunities. So that is continuing, and actually our current class are being interviewed this week for 2016, so I'm happy to see that moving forward. The other thing I would highlight that is just you know, a timely event, we are actually hosting our board meeting, I think for the first time, but it's very unusual to have our board meeting outside of New York, and it will actually be in Hong Kong this year. Wow. So that's a really big statement in terms of recognizing that yes, we are an American company, but it's important that we recognize all of the regions that we're operating in, and will be a great experience, and hopefully the board members will also experience our products while they're there, and another step in the journey.
Okay, so having looked at the research, let me ask each of you, if there is a program, an innovation, something that you've experienced that you think people here, people watching, you'd say, take a look at this. This is really worth thinking about for your organization. Isabel?
Sure. So back to the research, I'll think one thing that I will take away is sponsorship and the importance for sponsorship to allow you to continue growing in your career. So let me share a personal story. 2010, November, I came back from maternity leave after 3 months having my first child. And I came back with 100% clarity that I wanted to make a bigger impact and, continue the journey. And I was having a conversation with my manager at the time, and he was talking to me about how busy he was with an annual offsite. He didn't know what to do about the content. And I said, hey, I can help you. I can help you with this. These are my ideas. This turned into something much bigger, where he gave me the opportunity to actually present the main theme of the content in that plenary session with 300 plus people, all the different senior leaders of the different line of business were there, the president of the company was there. So the point I want to make, it was a fantastic platform for me to have visibility, right? Now, in thinking and relating this back to sponsorship, he took a risk, right? Because he trusted me. He knew I will not do 100%, but 150%. I could not afford to let him down. But it's taken a lot of time, right, to build that trust for him to give me that assignment. The point that I want to make is the sponsorship is a two-way street. Right? I think you mentioned that in the book. You have, as an individual, take the responsibility and offer your service and your value to others, because in order to receive, you have to give first. And the journey doesn't stop there, right? You had to continue refreshing the sponsorships. If I look at me right now at my role, I had to keep on looking who are the next set of sponsors. How do I stand out of the crowd? And how do I get the next person that give me that stretch assignment, whatever that is? And you need to have clarity of what that is, right? So the responsibility is on you, and you need to add value for people to give you the opportunity. So again, back to the question about what really, if I had to give a piece of advice, think about sponsorship thoroughly, and very different from mentorship is,
I think that's I think it's a very important point. I mean, what I always say, which I learned through the work that CTI did on sponsorship, to me, the difference between mentoring and sponsorship is, mentoring is what happens when you're in the room. Mm-hmm. Sponsorship is what happens when you're not in the room. Mm-hmm. Where you can't have any influence directly on the decision. Mm-hmm. Your sponsor has to be there to make the case for you, and presumably that's how you got that gig.
Correct. Yeah.
Van Dijk, what would you throw out?
Let me give you an example with a client that we have. It's a South African-based company. The name is Dimension Data. But they're present in a number of countries, over 25, 30 countries. And one of the things that we were tasked to do is actually create the opportunity for people from all the hubs to be exposed to top leadership, because the intent of this program, which I prefer calling intervention, was to showcase the best they had to people who could actually work with them during a period of time, face-to-face and then offline, because the program was blended, technological enabled, and also face-to-face, several different touch points throughout a year, and have the opportunity to create those bonds that I was referring to with people that don't get seen at the different locations where you have top management. It's a very diffuse company around the world. They have a lot of operations here in London, but they also have a lot of operations in South Africa. How do we get that? How do we bridge that gap? So one of the things that when we designed this product was super important to us is that soft skills, sponsorship, the double pivot, I call it modulation, but it's very much the concept that you have created. I like pivot. Is something that you don't teach cognitively. You cannot stand in front of a crowd and teach people how to actively listen or have presence. This is a learning journey that you have to get the cues, but you have to experience them, and you have to live them. You have to mess up in order to get right, and you have people to feedback that to you. Say, that's where you went wrong, and this is where you had it very right. It has to have more than one touch point. So it's not a cognitive business school-like type of interaction. So what I was thinking about when I was taking notes here is the process of exposing people purposefully, designed to purpose. to get them to learn the skills. This is teachable, but it's not cognitively teachable. It is experiential in nature through and through.
Sophia, what would you put your money on?
One topic I just wanted to kind of pull us back to that's also in the research is the idea of the use of technology and how we use technology to communicate. And I think, again, from my personal experience in managing a very diverse team, the diversity of technology now sort of helps you. And I think sometimes as managers and leaders, we get very fixed in our ways, right? We like our deck presentations, or we like in-person meetings, and that's how we operate. And the reality nowadays is different teams around the world, you need to be using multi-channels. And I think my favorite learning is just how often now instant messaging is part of our communication. Yeah. And what I love about instant messaging is that breaks down the cultures and the time zones and even the generational. I have really enjoyed communicating with much more junior people in the organization who are now comfortable, popping me a note. Sophia, could I speak with you? And I actually last night it happened. I had 4 all at the same time, and I'm like, okay. But it's embracing new technology and thinking about how that can change your inclusive leadership, how you relate to people, how you save people time, right? I've never been a big fan of decks, and again, large companies, we all still have them. But just thinking about different ways of communicating and getting decisions made, that's what's going to speed things up. And I think there's a wonderful section in the research about different examples of using different technology. So
very good. Well, okay, we've got access to 2 kinds of digital technology.
Oh.
We may have some questions coming in, and then there's also the old school digital technology. Anybody who wants to ask a question, that's
or you can send from here so we can
actually, I know some companies who do that.
They do that. Yeah.
People, who's had an email from the person in the office next door? Okay, we've got a little time for Q&A now. So anybody who wants to come in, let me just I'll invite you first of all, when you speak, to say who you are, and then if the directed at a particular member of the panel, say who that is. So, gentleman over here, and then the gentleman over there.
Thank you very much. Good morning, guys. My name's Tom Armitage, and I work for Pearson in leadership development. Thanks to Sylvia, to Rod, and to the speaker panel for sharing your insights this morning with us. A lot of the competencies or qualities that are required of global execs, people get it intellectually and conceptually in terms of they think they're important, but when it comes to then asking for sponsorship and investment in helping execs to develop in those areas, sometimes it can be disproportionate. So I just wonder, what's the best way to really start to build and win sponsorship for capability building, essentially?
When you say disproportionate, do you mean example?
So people think, business leaders get that things like executive presence are important, but actually it's quite difficult to demonstrate a return on that particular, if you were to develop somebody in that.
Tom, I'm going to take this one. I think this is a...
He's taking over.
Whoa! I feel a story coming on here.
There's no story.
I feel some pain here.
My livelihood depends on this. This is what we do with organizations, but it's not. This is not a sales pitch. The important thing here, and one of the things that we do with our clients in learning and development, or HR, is to teach them how to tell the story to top management. One of the problems that we lack in this industry is the ability to show measurements, and measurement is crucial. That's the reason why at CLA we have an entire division dedicated to what we call efficacy, which is to show the impact, the business impact and the learning impacts that we produce by doing that. It's not just dollars and cents in the end. Of course, there's much more than that. But somehow in the value chain, they correlate with things that people appreciate. The money man, the CFO. So it's a type of conversation that can be had with a CEO and a CFO beyond HR. So this is the first point. The other thing is being able to tell the story. Normally HR is more emotional in the way you tell a story. So there is a pivot there for you. The way that you tell a story to people in headquarters in the C-suite depends on an ability, which is a soft skill but is very hard to obtain, to modulate in the language they will accept, instead of it's going to be good for the people, the morale, etc. Not that those things are not counting, but there is a different way to get to their hearts and pockets.
So it's a narrative.
Yeah.
Style of narrative. Okay, let me
If I can add,
Karen.
can I add? I think organizations can be more intentional about teaching those things. And I just tell you my own experience, and in my own firm, we have, for example, a senior women leadership program. It's a 12-month program. And it's targeting senior females, right? But it could be targeting anybody else. This specific example is senior females, with the idea of retaining them as well as to bring into the next step. A big piece of that, and I think, Sylvia, you've been sort of helping us a bit on this, is on executive presence. Mm-hmm. So there's actually a specific piece, very, very intentional about what executive presence means, what are the actions and the things that you need to do in relation to pivoting your communication style and your leadership presence. It also has a one-to-one coach. It brings a platform for these females to actually get access to senior members of the executive team and bring that visibility to them and start having conversations and discussions, as well as a network, a support network across them so that they can actually brainstorm, share ideas, and so on. So I just mentioned that as one initiative, but back to the point, organizations, firms can put in place programs to help to have that type of discussion.
Anything you want to it? How do you okay. All right. By the way, here's your reward. Your reward for your work so far.
Well deserved.
Thank you.
There you have it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I thought we were going to get something else.
Hello there, panel. It's Ricky Ford here, Director for Talent EMEA from McGraw-Hill Financial. So my interests here are in the areas of sponsorship. So we have mentoring programs, either corporately for specific grade levels, or our senior execs will say to their team, right, I expect each of you to be a mentor. I want to know who you're mentoring. So you've got a one-to-one person man-to-man marking across the organisation. But if sponsorship is so brilliant, we have some brilliant hypos who just by luck or influence have great sponsors, but it's very informal. And it's only the chosen few who get the best sponsors who tend to be in head office. How can you institutionalize sponsorship and make sure that the majority of your, let's say it's targeted at hypos, have sponsors that are allocated to them, or do they find them by chemistry or networks? How can it work successfully?
Just for the sake of me, I'm thinking hypo means hypertension. Is that
Yes,
right?
you're
Yeah.
right.
I know everybody else in the room knows that, but just in case.
I'd love to take that one. So I think what's most important with sponsorship is the education around it, and it's having that label and having people truly understand what it is. Because I think, within your question, it's not something that's easily fabricated, right? You can't just create a sponsor in the way that you can assign a mentor. So I think the education component is critical, and it's both educating individuals as employees so that they are thinking about, who are my sponsors? Because the reality is that the word may be new in the business context, but the concept isn't new. So I think having people truly understand who their sponsors are and think about that as a relationship they need to nurture, right? So there's a responsibility of the employees. I think what we have also done is very much, now that we have that language kind of in our DNA, when we have talent reviews and senior leaders are looking at hypos and high potential individuals, they are now starting to think about their own responsibility as a sponsor. So thinking about, I may not know that individual, and now the accountability is on the leaders to reach out, get to know, think through where are those real business opportunities to connect. Because I think you said it earlier as well, Sylvia, it's hard to be a sponsor if you don't know the person and their work, right? It's one thing to know someone socially, but to see their work, trust, understand their reputation, all of those are important elements on the road to sponsorship. So I think it's a challenge. I don't think it's something that can be switched on overnight. But we have at least found that bringing it into the nomenclature, educating people on the concept, differentiating it from mentors and advocates, that's been an important step for us.
Trevor, if I can just
Sure.
come in there. We have now helped design and followed 19 different sponsorship initiatives. I say initiatives rather than programs because, you can't really force match very successfully here. We would be very happy to share, these examples. We've evaluated them, stuff like that. So, talk to one of us and we'll help you access that.
There's an opportunity.
Thank you.
Just quickly, and then I've got a couple more.
Sure. Completely agree with what you said. I think, again, looking into a sponsorship, you need to know, once you've got the awareness of how that works, you have to take the onus is on you. Nobody's going to make it happen for you. You have to know what your unique value is, what your currency is, and what you bring to the table, and get out of your comfort zone to reach out to people that you naturally may not have to interact with. But find your way, navigate, because that's the only way.
I completely agree with Isabel on this. I think the onus, you're much better off developing people who want to gain sponsorship than developing sponsors. Sponsors, you're going to do a show, tell them it's good for the company, and they're going to have a million reasons not to do it. But once you have those unique relationships forged on values, integrity, purpose, but also on things that have nothing to do with the business, it's a natural thing. People volunteer to be sponsors. They cannot be forced to be sponsors. So getting young people in different locations around the world, different genders, different races, ethnicities, what you have it, to understand and be able to map the type of organization they work for and who are the people who are most likely to be aligned with them in those values, those formal values of the organization, but also those things that go beyond, is something that's learnable. You can teach that to people.
Okay, I'm going to take one here, and a gentleman here, and the lady at the back.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hi. My name is Sophia Matveeva, and I lead business development and communications at a social news site called Blasting News, and I'm also Chicago Youth MBA. So I'm going to start with a question about data. For Sylvia, your data about the 6 competencies of gravitas, to me it looked like a lot of the percentages were actually the same. So the data was very similar. So even if you're saying that one competency is number 1, say in China, but it's number 4 in Brazil, the actual percentages next to the labels were very similar. So how important is that? Or is the research saying that these are the 6 top qualities everywhere? It's just one is a bit more important and one is a bit less important somewhere else.
So if you wouldn't come back at that towards the end,
Sure.
I just want to get a couple of lady here and then.
Hello. It's working. Hello, my name is Natalie Peach, and I work in Pearson. I'm in charge of HR for venture markets. You made it sound quite easy to actually maintain the alignment between your personal integrity and the regional pivot, managing the regional pivot. And I wonder if in your experience there were moments where it wasn't that easy. And I look after 16 markets. One of them is Saudi. And as a woman and with the local culture there, I have found myself in situations where I can think, wow, I'm not so sure on how to keep that alignment personally. Has it happened to you?
Let me just take this gentleman here.
Hello, I'm Rafat Malik. I work for the Corporate Learning Alliance. I'm actually curious about this notion of sponsorship. So many of us have heard about reverse mentorship. Is there such a thing as reverse sponsorship? The reason why I ask this is that I come from a military background and we are measured on our ability to lead, and that measure is not on who is above us, it's who is behind us. I just wanted to throw that out there as a question.
Okay. Do you mean by that somebody, your captain, you have to have a sergeant who's invested in you?
Our real measure are what we have done for the people who we are leading.
Okay, gotcha. Okay. Actually, I think this is probably the last round we can have. Who wants to come back and deal with the question on sponsorship and difficulties? Well, these are both about sponsorship.
Yeah, I think on the back you were talking more about the pivoting and the in the values, and your example in Saudi. I look after the EMEA region, and the Middle East is a big region of growth for us, and had to open the office 8 years ago. I understand there's the female or the gender divide in some parts like Saudi. I think the remaining of the states is pretty okay in my opinion. But the way, again, you need to find your way of navigating, right? Because in my example, I work very closely with identify a local manager that I empower accordingly, and I would seek his advice on helping me. How do I manage that meeting? Okay, we're going to be meeting the CEO of this bank, and how can I help you so that I don't undermine him? But at the same time, I'm, the leader, senior person in that meeting. And it's about knowing what to do and getting the guidance through. I think integrity remains, right? They are going to see you as a female. There's not an issue. Things have moved on. But it's knowing how to navigate and adapt a little bit, be respectful of some of the values there that may not be completely in contradiction, and find the person there that can actually help you, your guide.
Sophia, something you've come across?
Yes, very similar answer. I think it really is about that balance in the navigation. And I haven't always got it right. I think my personal example was I had a meeting in Russia, and I'd literally flown in for this particular meeting, and then was held waiting in a hallway for 4 hours. And at some point, or it was told that I would be waiting for 4 hours, and I took a risky decision to sort of assert myself and say, I've flown in for this meeting, we'll be meeting now. And I proceeded with the attendees who were there without the senior leader, and they miraculously showed up and appeared in the meeting, and we kept going. So I took a bit of a risk and a bit of a gamble. It was a bit of gamesmanship. I believe it was, because I was a woman and because I was coming into this meeting. And that one played off. It could have gone horribly wrong, and I would have left, and it would have all been a bit of a mess. But I think you just have to use your judgment, try to navigate, and take a few risks sometimes in terms of what you're confident in. But again, I would say that wasn't an integrity situation. It was just a different management style and a different pivot in terms of what was expected and how I was expected to respond. I don't know if that's helpful.
Well, and have you got any thoughts on this question about sponsorship from below?
Yeah, okay, so back again to sponsorship, I think it's two-way, right? Back to reverse mentoring. I see it as differently from sponsorship. Sponsorship, you have to, again, reach out, get out of your comfort zone, and find that person or people that can give you that stretch assignment by providing your own value. At the same time, you are also expected, to sponsor other people, because in order for you to grow in your organization and take the next assignment, you need to have the people on the back, that are giving, building your legacy for you. So I see it two-way, and I think it's different from reverse mentoring, in my opinion. I don't know if, Sylvia, you may have a different view.
And I would agree. I think we focus on that. It's under followership. So I think followership's a critical component to be a successful global executive. But I do think sponsorship is still it's a very unique definition, and is more about kind of the actions that a sponsor is taking for a protege. So I think I would agree with you, which is I think they're different concepts. Both are critical to success, as a leader going forward.
I think this is very highly relevant because people in positions of power, they listen to the crowds. This is true for politics, this is true in the military, this is true in any organization. So even though you might be sandwiched between the followers that would be putting a good word for the boss to the boss's bosses, that relationship is fundamental because the boss's bosses, they listen to the bottom as well. And that in listening to the crowd, the words in the market, the proverbial man on the street or the person on the street, this is something that can usher or propel you into a position that will get you noticed. I think this is an important level of pivot, to understand how to impact up and down without being perceived as directing it.
Okay. If I say one thing about the question that was asked about essentially being in situations where people aren't going to look at you or take you that seriously. Yep. I always find the element of shock and awe is always rather helpful. One of my tricks is simply to start speaking French, because nobody expects that. My French is very, very poor, but the fact is that for 2 minutes people are so astonished by this bizarre. More seriously, I am president of a big retailer here, and we have a quarterly council which has people from all over the business, including very young people who are shop workers. And the last council, a young woman who's new to the council, must be in her early 20s, young black woman actually, stood up to make a contribution, and not that anybody was disrespectful, but you could tell people weren't concentrating. And she started her contribution by quoting Nietzsche. And I can't actually remember what the quote was, because it wasn't one of your standard, that which doesn't kill me makes it all. It was completely obscure, and it was utterly irrelevant to the point.
Right.
Everybody listened to her for the rest of the day. Shock and awe, surprise is always helpful.
Mm-hmm. This point is something that I was going to want to take so much airtime, but to your point in the back, the power of surprise is something. Of course, it is not something you have to drop all the time, but your reaction, Sophia, in terms of not imposing yourself, but showing I came here with a purpose, is very interesting. We have a lady that works with us, okay, and she runs a Women's Leadership Forum in Saudi Arabia. And women's leadership means that you're going to interact with a bunch of different types of people, different nations, different origins, religions, and genders. How could we have done the program behind a screen when the males were teaching the females? So this person who is responsible for this program, she turned to the powers that be in Saudi Arabia, and she pushed back and she said, if we teach behind a screen, we defeat the purpose of this. So if we don't do in front of the screen, I'm calling off the program, and so be it. Do you know what happened? The program was taught, the program went on, people were experienced, we respected gender distance, people were not touching each other, people were not shaking hands with women, but the male presenters, the male profs, we had experiences with them, people who were running the experiences, they were in front of the people, the women.
Sorry about that, I'm going to stop because we are going to run out of the technology. First of all, it's been a really fascinating discussion. I'd like to thank our panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Sylvia.
And before we close up, I'd like to give the floor back to Professor Hewlett.
I'm just going to be very brief. It's been an extraordinarily illuminating and I think all kinds of value added in the panel. Two things. On Monday, we did a preview of this study in Sao Paulo. We had 70 executives in the room, and the urgency of this topic was palpable. Not only do the usual set of critical issues apply in Brazil, but this is a country in recession. And in the room was an extraordinary array of amazing talent, who felt stalled, who felt that they were not being heard or seen, and were desperate for voice. And I feel that it gave me a sense of the importance of this work and indeed the critical quality of this need to tap into, top talent around the world and precisely give them the voice and the pathway to climb further and join the ranks of, senior leaders. I also am reminded of a tiny story, which I think goes to your point, the reverse power of this thing. One of the most powerful interviews I did for my book on sponsorship, which lays out the evidence behind how this works, was an interview I did with the CEO of an engineering firm. And he said he knew all about sponsorship, although he hadn't used that word. He said, when I do the last interviews for individuals who are being considered to be one of my direct reports, I ask the critical question, which is, how many people do you have in your pocket? And what I mean by that, how many people have you sponsored over the years who are now dotted around this company, so that if I asked you to do something impossible next week, which involved liaising across, 4 sectors and 5 countries, you could actually pull it off. Because there are folks out there who think you're wonderful, who you made a critical contribution to, who really will respond and put your project first. He said, I'm not interested in anyone who doesn't have deep pockets. And these days, given the fact that 2/3 of our revenues come from outside this country, there better be deep, diverse pockets. Yeah. So this is a profound two-way street, and it's enormously valuable. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Trevor, thank you.